The crisp autumn air nipped at my cheeks as I smoothed the delicate lace of my dress, the same one I'd worn on our wedding day 15 years ago. It had been my idea to renew our vows and finally sanctify our marriage in the eyes of God. For years we had talked about it, putting it off for one reason or another: work, kids, life. But today was supposed to mark a new chapter. A fresh start in a love I thought had weathered every storm. Jack walked beside me, his hand warm around mine, his smile serene. "You look beautiful," he said softly, and I felt a flicker of pride. This was the man I had chosen, the man I'd shared my life with, the father of my children. We had come so far together. Yet, beneath my excitement, there was a faint unease I couldn't place, like the shadow of a bird passing overhead. The church doors creaked open, and the scent of wood polish and candles enveloped me. The pews were empty except for my sister, who smiled at me from the front row, and the priest, Father Michael, who stood waiting at the altar. Everything was perfect, yet something inside me tensed as we approached. Father Michael greeted us with a warm smile, his weathered face kind and reassuring. "Before we begin," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "there's a matter I need to discuss with you both." Jack's grip on my hand tightened, almost imperceptibly, but I noticed. "Is there a problem?" I asked, my voice steady despite the sudden flutter in my chest. Father Michael hesitated, his eyes darting to Jack and then back to me. "This is delicate. Perhaps we could speak privately for a moment." "No," I said quickly, my heart pounding now. "If it concerns us both, we'll hear it together." Jack's jaw tightened, and for the first time that day, his smile faltered. The priest sighed, his expression tinged with sorrow. "Mrs. Carter, before we can proceed with a blessing, the church requires confirmation that neither party has previously entered into a sacramental marriage." I blinked, confused. "Of course. We've been married for 15 years. Father Michael's gaze didn't waver. "Mr. Carter, would you like to explain?" The silence that followed was deafening. I turned to Jack, my breath caught in my throat. "What is he talking about?" Jack's face turned ashen. I didn't think it would matter," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "What wouldn't matter?" My voice was rising now, echoing through the empty church. My sister shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes wide with concern. Father Michael cleared his throat, but it was Jack who spoke, his words stumbling out like a confession. "I was married before you," he said. "In the church. It was a long time ago. I didn't think it counted anymore because we divorced." The room spun around me. "You were married?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "And you never told me?" "I didn't think it mattered," he repeated, his voice rising defensively. "We were young. It was a mistake. It ended years before I met you." Father Michael interjected, his tone firm. "Mr. Carter, a sacramental marriage is indissoluble in the eyes of the church. Divorce does not annul it." The words hit me like a thunderclap. I pulled my hand from Jack's grasp, stepping back as the weight of what I was hearing crushed me. "So what does this mean?" I asked, my voice breaking. "We're not really married?" Father Michael hesitated, but the truth was in his eyes. "In the eyes of the church, your union cannot be blessed until the previous marriage is annulled, a process that requires investigation and approval." I felt the room closing in around me. 15 years of memories of love, of sacrifices, unraveled in an instant. My legs felt weak and I reached out, steadying myself on the back of a pew. "You lied to me," I said, my voice barely a whisper now. Jack stepped toward me, his hands outstretched. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you because it didn't matter anymore. We're married, Sarah. We have a life together." "A life built on a lie," I shot back, the sharpness of my voice surprising even me. Tears blurred my vision as I turned away, unable to look at him. This man I thought I knew, this man I had trusted with everything, had kept a secret so monumental it threatened to unravel everything we'd built. My sister approached, her arms wrapping around me as I sobbed. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear off the dress that suddenly felt like a mockery of everything I believed in. "I need time," I whispered, pulling away from Jack as he reached for me. "I need to think." "Sarah, please," he begged, his voice desperate. "Don't let this ruin us." But it already had. I left the church that day not as a wife reaffirming her vows, but as a woman shattered by the weight of betrayal. Over the following weeks, I grappled with questions I had never thought I'd have to ask. Could I forgive him? Could I move forward knowing our marriage was never what I believed it to be? In the quiet of those sleepless nights, I found an unexpected clarity. Jack's lie had stolen something sacred from me, not just my trust, but my sense of who we were as a couple. He had robbed me of the chance to make an informed choice about the life I wanted. In the end, I realized that love cannot thrive in the shadow of secrets. I couldn't undo the past, but I could choose my future. So I chose to let go. It wasn't easy. The unraveling of a marriage, especially one so deeply intertwined with your identity, is like ripping out a part of your soul. But as I walked away from Jack and the life we'd built, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth, as painful as it was, had set me free. The weeks that followed felt like wandering through a fog. The house, once warm and filled with laughter, now echoed with silence. Jack stayed in the guest room, giving me space, but his presence lingered everywhere. In the scent of his cologne, the coffee mug he still used every morning, the way his voice softened when he spoke to the kids. He was trying, I could see that. Every day he'd ask if I wanted to talk, if we could find a way to move past this. But I wasn't ready. Maybe I'd never be ready. I threw myself into routines, clinging to the familiar. Work was my sanctuary, a place where my emotions couldn't betray me. At home, I tried to focus on the kids, keeping their world intact even as mine crumbled. They didn't understand what was happening, and I didn't know how to explain it without unraveling even more of the life they thought was stable. Mom and Dad need some time to work through things, I told them, forcing a smile I didn't feel. They nodded, trusting me to hold everything together, but their worried glances spoke volumes. Nights were the hardest. Alone in our bed, I replayed the priest's words, Jack's confession, and the years we'd spent together. How could I reconcile the man who held me through the births of our children, who danced with me in the kitchen, who wiped away my tears during hard times, with the man who had hidden such a fundamental truth? It wasn't just the lie, it was what it represented. A lack of faith in me, in us, to handle the truth together. One night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from my sister. "How are you holding up?" Simple words, but they broke something inside me. I typed back quickly, "I feel like I don't know who I married." Her reply was immediate. "You don't have to figure it out all at once. Just take it one day at a time." The next morning, I found Jack sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes weary but determined. "I've been researching annulments," he said quietly. "It's not a simple process, but I've already reached out to the diocese. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I stared at him, unsure whether to feel relief or anger. "Why now?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Why didn't you do this before we got married? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Because I was ashamed, Sarah. I was young and stupid, and I made a mistake. I thought I could just leave it behind, that it didn't matter anymore. But it does matter. You matter." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I wanted to believe him. But the wound was still too fresh. "You can't just erase this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not that simple." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I'm trying. Please tell me what I can do." I didn't have an answer for him. How could I? My heart was a battlefield, torn between love and betrayal, between the life we had built and the foundation it was built on. I walked out of the kitchen without another word, leaving him alone with his papers and his guilt. Days turned into weeks, and I began to see a therapist, hoping to untangle the mess of emotions that consumed me. In those sessions, I confronted not just Jack's betrayal, but my own role in our marriage. Had I ignored signs, dismissed his silences, taken for granted that we were always on the same page? The truth was, I had never thought to question him. I had trusted him completely, and that trust had been shattered. But amidst the pain, I found moments of clarity. Jack's lie didn't define me. It didn't erase the love I had given, the sacrifices I had made, or the person I had become. Slowly, I began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been lost in the chaos of our marriage. I started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago. I spent more time with friends, rediscovering the joy of connection outside the confines of my identity as a wife and mother. Jack, for his part, was relentless in his efforts to make amends. He attended counseling sessions both alone and with me, and he continued the annulment process, even though I hadn't promised him anything. "This isn't just for you," he told me one day. "It's for me too. I need to make peace with my past if I ever want a chance at rebuilding our future." Rebuilding. The word lingered in my mind. Could we rebuild? And if we did, what would that future look like? Would I ever truly forgive him? Or would the shadow of his deception always loom between us? One evening, as the kids slept and the house was quiet, Jack knocked on the door to the bedroom. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. I hesitated, then nodded. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I know I've hurt you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know I can't undo what I've done. But I need you to know that I love you, Sarah. I've always loved you. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you'll let me." Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't look away. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I said honestly. "I don't know if I can ever see you the same way." "I understand," he said. "But I'm not giving up. Not on you, not on us." In that moment I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had made mistakes, yes, but who was willing to fight for what mattered. And while I wasn't ready to forgive him yet, I realized that maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't about finding the answers all at once. It was about taking small steps, one day at a time, toward a future that was still unwritten. The days stretched into months, each one testing the fragile threads of our lives as we tried to make sense of what had happened. Jack moved out of the house eventually, though he made it clear it wasn't because he wanted to leave the family. "I think we need space," he had said, his voice steady but sad. "You need time to figure out what you want, and I need to show you I'm serious about fixing this. Even if it means waiting." The house felt emptier without him, and while part of me relished the quiet, another part ached for the familiar sound of his voice, the comfort of his presence. I had loved him for so long that even the thought of a life without him felt foreign, like trying to breathe in an unfamiliar atmosphere. Yet, every time I considered reconciliation, the memory of that church, the weight of his deception, came rushing back to remind me why I couldn't simply forgive and forget. I buried myself in routines, pouring more of myself into work and the kids. The children seemed to sense the shift in our family dynamic, but they rarely asked questions. "Where's Dad staying?" our youngest Lily asked one evening as I tucked her into bed. "At Uncle Mike's house for a while," I replied, brushing her hair back gently. "Is he coming back?" Her wide eyes searched mine, and I felt the familiar sting of guilt and uncertainty rise in my chest. "I don't know, sweetie," I said softly. "We're trying to figure things out. But no matter what happens, your dad and I both love you and your brother more than anything." She nodded, her little face thoughtful, and I kissed her forehead, promising myself I'd shield them from as much of this mess as I could. They didn't need to carry the burden of what was unraveling between Jack and me. But the burden wasn't one I could carry alone. My therapy sessions became a lifeline, a place where I could speak the truth of my anger, sadness, and confusion without fear of judgment. "I hate him some days," I admitted once, my voice shaking with emotion. "And other days I miss him so much it hurts. How do I hold both of those things at the same time?" My therapist nodded knowingly. "Grief is complicated," she said. "And what you're experiencing is a kind of grief, the loss of the relationship you thought you had. It's okay to feel contradictory things. Healing doesn't require you to make sense of it all right now." That idea stayed with me. I didn't have to have all the answers. I just needed to keep moving forward one step at a time. Jack, meanwhile, continued his efforts to show me he had changed. He called regularly, not to push me or beg for forgiveness, but to ask how I was doing, how the kids were. He kept up with the annulment process, attending meetings with the diocese and gathering the necessary documentation. "It's slow," he admitted during one of our calls. "But I'm not giving up. I know this might not fix anything between us, but I need to see it through." His persistence surprised me. This wasn't the Jack I'd known, the man who always sought the path of least resistance, who avoided confrontation and left the hard work to others. For the first time in years I saw him fighting, not just for me but for himself, for the kind of man he wanted to be. Still, I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to let him back in, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, The wall of anger and hurt began to crack. It happened one evening when he came by to pick up the kids for a weekend visit. He stood in the doorway, a hesitant smile on his face as Lily ran to hug him. "Hi, Sarah," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Hi," I replied, folding my arms across my chest. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked after the kids had rushed off to grab their bags. I hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let him in. We stood in the living room, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "I just wanted to say thank you," he began, "for letting me see the kids, for being so patient with all of this. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." His humility caught me off guard. "You're their father," I said simply. "They need you in their lives." "And I need them," he admitted. "And you. I know I've hurt you, Sarah, more than I can ever make up for. But I hope someday you'll see that I'm trying to be better. Not just for you, but for me too." Something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, softened the knot of tension I'd been holding onto for so long. "I see it, Jack," I said quietly. "But seeing it doesn't erase the hurt. It's going to take time." "I'll wait," he said simply. And he did. Months passed, and while we didn't magically fall back into place, we began to rebuild something. Slowly, tentatively. We attended counseling sessions together, where we talked about the ways we had both failed in our marriage, the things we had left unsaid for too long. I learned things about Jack I had never known. His fears, his insecurities, the guilt he had carried for years over his first marriage and the way it had ended. "It wasn't that I didn't trust you," he said during one session. "I didn't trust myself. I thought if I told you the truth, you'd leave me, and I couldn't face that." His words were a revelation, peeling back layers of a man I had thought I knew completely. And in turn, I shared my own truths, the ways I had shut him out when life became overwhelming, the expectations I had placed on him without realizing it. Healing was messy, non-linear. Some days felt like progress. Others felt like reopening old wounds. But little by little, we began to find our way back to each other. The annulment process was finalized a year after that fateful day in the church. Jack handed me the paperwork with a quiet sense of accomplishment, his eyes searching mine for any sign of what it might mean for us. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady but kind, "for seeing this through." He nodded, a flicker of hope in his expression. "Does this mean?" "It means we've come a long way," I said honestly. "But we still have further to go." And that was the truth. Ours wasn't a story of sudden redemption or easy forgiveness. It was a story of two people who had been broken, who had hurt each other deeply, but who chose to keep trying. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. And while I didn't know what the future held, for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it one step at a time. Jack and I continued to navigate the fragile terrain of rebuilding our relationship. The annulment may have been a milestone, but it was far from the final chapter. If anything, it was a starting point, a line drawn in the sand between the life we had and the life we were trying to create. What lay beyond it was still uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I was open to the possibility of a future together. We started spending more time together as a family. At first it was just for the kids, a dinner here, a movie night there. I told myself it wasn't about us, that it was about giving Lily and Evan a sense of stability. But as the weeks went on, I found myself looking forward to these moments, to the way Jack made the kids laugh, to the way he still instinctively knew how I liked my coffee. One Saturday, while we were all at the park, Jack stayed behind with me on the bench while the kids played on the swings. "They're happy," he said, watching Lily giggle as Evan pushed her higher. "They are," I agreed, though my eyes were on Jack more than the children. "I think it's because they see us together again," he continued. Then cautiously he added, "even if it's just a start." I didn't respond right away, letting the words settle. The truth was, I felt it too, that sense of ease, of familiarity that came from being around him again. But I wasn't ready to give him the reassurance he was looking for. Not yet. Instead I said, "They've always loved you, Jack. That hasn't changed." He nodded, though I could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. Still, he didn't push, and I was grateful for that. As the months wore on, those family outings became more frequent. We found a rhythm that felt natural, even if it wasn't exactly what we'd had before. Jack and I continued therapy, both together and separately. In those sessions, I began to unravel not just the hurt from his betrayal, but also the ways I had contributed to the distance that had grown between us over the years. It's not about blame, my therapist reminded me during one session. It's about understanding. You can't move forward without understanding the patterns that brought you here in the first place. Slowly, I began to see the truth in her words. Our marriage had been far from perfect, even before Jack's confession. There were moments I had dismissed his attempts to connect, moments I had retreated into myself instead of reaching out to him. I had been so focused on the roles we played, parents, partners, providers, that I'd lost sight of the relationship underneath it all. One evening after the kids were asleep, I called Jack. It had been months since he'd moved out, and while we talked almost daily, this call felt different. "Can you come over?" I asked, my voice hesitant. "Of course," he said immediately. When he arrived, I was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in hand. He looked nervous, standing in the doorway as though he wasn't sure if he should sit or keep his distance. "Jack," I said, gesturing for him to join me. He sat down, careful to leave space between us. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that's happened, and I realize that if we're going to try to move forward, I need to be honest with you too." His brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. "I've been angry," I admitted. "Not just at you but at myself. For not seeing it, for not asking more questions, for trusting so completely that I didn't even think to wonder if there was something I didn't know." "That's not your fault," he said quickly. "Sarah, you trusted me because I gave you every reason to. I'm the one who broke that trust. But it's more than that," I continued, holding up a hand to stop him. "I've been angry because I let myself lose sight of who we were. I've spent so much time focusing on what you did wrong, but I didn't see all the ways we drifted apart before that. I didn't fight for us the way I should have." Jack's eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked like he might reach for my hand. But he held back, his voice quiet. "I didn't fight for us either. I took you for granted, Sarah. I thought we were solid, that nothing could touch us. And then when the truth came out, I realized how much I'd failed you. Not just with the lie, but with everything." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared regrets hanging in the air. "I don't know what the future looks like," I said finally, "but I think I'm ready to start figuring it out. Together." Jack exhaled, as though he'd been holding his breath. "I'll take whatever you're willing to give, Sarah. One day at a time, one step at a time. Just tell me what you need." And so we began again, not as the couple we had been, but as two people trying to find their way back to each other. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when old wounds reopened, when the scars of the past felt too raw to ignore. But there were also moments of joy, of connection, of hope. We started going on dates again, rediscovering the simple pleasure of being in each other's company. Some nights we stayed up talking for hours, sharing stories and dreams we hadn't spoken of in years. Other nights we simply sat in comfortable silence, grateful for the chance to be near each other again. The kids noticed the change too. Lily, ever perceptive, asked me one night, "Are you and Dad going to get married again?" I smiled, brushing her hair back. "We're still figuring things out, sweetie. But we love you, and that will never change." Jack and I took our time, rebuilding not just our relationship, but our understanding of what it meant to love and forgive. It wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about choosing to move forward, even with the scars it left behind. And in the end, that choice, to keep trying, to keep loving despite the pain, became the foundation of something new, something stronger, something real. As the months turned into a year, Jack and I found ourselves settling into a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before, how could it be? But it was something steady, something real. There were still moments of doubt, nights when I'd lie awake and wonder if I was making the right choice. Trust doesn't return all at once. It creeps back slowly like a cautious guest, waiting to see if it's truly welcome. But I was learning to let it in little by little, one act of faith at a time. Jack was patient, never rushing me, never demanding more than I could give. He showed up for me, for the kids, for the life we were trying to rebuild. He was consistent in a way he hadn't always been before, and I began to see the man I had fallen in love with so many years ago. Not perfect but earnest, flawed but willing to grow. The small gestures meant the most. The way he'd text me to make sure I ate lunch on a busy day, the flowers he brought home for no reason, the evenings he spent helping Evan with his math homework even when he looked ready to pull his hair out. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Jack turned to me, his expression serious but calm. "Sarah, I've been thinking about something," he said. I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" "I know I've put you through so much, and I'll never stop trying to make it right. But I was wondering, would you ever consider renewing our vows? Officially this time. In the church." His voice was tentative, as though he wasn't sure how I'd react. For a moment I didn't say anything. The idea of standing in that church again, of making promises I wasn't sure we could keep, felt overwhelming. But then I looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had fought to win back my trust, who had owned his mistakes and done the work to become someone better. And I realized that I wanted to say yes, not because it would erase the past, but because it would honor the effort we had both made to create a new future. "I think I'd like that," I said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "But let's not rush it. I want to make sure we're really ready this time." Jack nodded, his relief palpable. "Of course. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." And so we began planning, not for a grand ceremony, but for something simple and intimate, something that felt true to who we were now. We chose a date months down the line, giving ourselves time to prepare, not just for the event but for the commitment it symbolized. It wasn't about perfection or appearances. It was about making a promise to keep trying, to keep choosing each other, even when it wasn't easy. As the date approached, I found myself reflecting on everything that had brought us to this point. The betrayal, the pain, the countless nights spent questioning everything I thought I knew about love and marriage. It had all shaped me, shaped us. And while I wouldn't wish that kind of heartache on anyone, I couldn't deny that it had forced us to confront the cracks in our foundation and rebuild something stronger. The day of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that felt like a blessing. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple dress I had chosen, and took a deep breath. My sister was there, fussing over my hair and makeup, but I could see the pride in her eyes. "You're really doing this," she said, her voice warm. "After everything, you're giving him another chance." "It's more than that," I said, meeting her gaze in the mirror. "I'm giving us another chance. And I'm giving myself the chance to believe that love can survive even the hardest things." When I walked into the church that afternoon, my heart was pounding, but not with fear. This time it felt different, calmer, steadier. Jack was waiting for me at the altar, his eyes shining with emotion as he watched me approach. The kids were sitting in the front row, grinning from ear to ear. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. As we exchanged our vows, I realized that they meant more now than they had on our wedding day 15 years ago. Back then, I had spoken those words with the naive certainty of someone who had never known real hardship. Now I spoke them with the full weight of experience, with the knowledge of how fragile love could be, and how resilient it could become when nurtured with care and honesty. "I promise to love you, to forgive you, to stand by you," I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "Not because it's easy, but because it's worth it." Jack's voice was thick with emotion as he repeated his own vows, his gaze never leaving mine. "I promise to earn your trust every day, to never take you for granted again, to love you with everything I have." When the ceremony ended and we stepped outside into the golden light of late afternoon, I felt a sense of release, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. Jack took my hand, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were stepping into a future that was truly ours to create. Life didn't magically become perfect after that day. We still had arguments, moments of doubt, times when the scars of the past threatened to resurface. But we faced those challenges together, with a commitment to honesty and openness that hadn't been there before. Slowly, trust rebuilt itself, not as the unshakable certainty it had once been, but as something more nuanced and enduring. The kids thrived in the new stability of our family, and as the years went on, I found myself looking back on that tumultuous time with a sense of gratitude. It had been the hardest chapter of my life, but it had also been the most transformative. It had taught me the true meaning of love, not the fairy tale version, but the kind that perseveres through pain and imperfection, the kind that grows stronger in the face of adversity. Jack and I grew older together, our bond deepening with each passing year. We celebrated milestones and weathered new challenges, always returning to the promises we had made that day in the church. And while our story was far from perfect, it was ours, a testament to the power of forgiveness, resilience, and the unwavering belief that love, even when broken, can be rebuilt. The years passed like chapters in a book, each one adding new layers to our story. After the vow renewal, Jack and I didn't suddenly become a flawless couple, nor did our lives transform into something out of a fairy tale. Instead, we settled into the quiet, messy, and perfect work of loving each other through whatever came next. What struck me most during those years was how much more intentional we had to be, about communication, about showing up for each other, about not letting old wounds define our future. Our children grew, and with them came new challenges and joys. Evan blossomed into a thoughtful, driven young man, his quiet intelligence balanced by a wicked sense of humor that could light up a room. Lily, ever spirited and full of life, kept us on our toes with her boundless energy and knack for asking the kinds of questions that made you rethink everything you thought you knew. Watching them grow was both humbling and bittersweet. They were becoming their own people, independent and strong, and while I was proud of them, I couldn't help but feel the weight of time slipping by. Jack and I found ways to carve out moments for ourselves amidst the chaos of raising teenagers. Some nights, after the kids were in bed, we'd sit on the back porch with a bottle of wine, talking about everything and nothing. Other times, we'd sneak away for a weekend trip, just the two of us, rediscovering the parts of our relationship that had once been buried under the weight of responsibility. These moments didn't erase the past, but they helped us write a new narrative, one built on the understanding that love isn't static. It's something you choose again and again, even when it's hard. There were still days when doubt crept in, when the memory of Jack's betrayal would resurface like a ghost, whispering in the back of my mind. But those moments became fewer and farther between as trust rebuilt itself, brick by brick. Jack had become a man I respected deeply, not because he was perfect, but because he had shown me what true accountability looked like. He never once asked me to forget what had happened. Instead, he worked tirelessly to ensure I never had to feel that kind of pain again. One of the biggest turning points came on our 20th wedding anniversary. By then, our lives had settled into a comfortable rhythm. We were no longer the same people who had stood in that church 5 years earlier, renewing our vows with tears in our eyes and uncertainty in our hearts. We had grown, together and as individuals, and that growth had brought us a kind of peace I hadn't thought possible. Jack surprised me that evening with a handwritten letter. He handed it to me as we sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting a warm glow over the room. "I've been thinking about how much has changed since the first time I said these words to you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I wanted to put it all down, to tell you what you mean to me now." I unfolded the letter carefully, my hands trembling slightly as I began to read. His words were raw and honest, a reflection of everything we had been through and everything we had become. He wrote about the regret he still carried for the pain he had caused, but also about the gratitude he felt for the second chance I had given him. He wrote about the ways I had inspired him, challenged him, and made him a better man. And he ended with a promise to keep choosing me every day for as long as we both lived. By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. I looked up at Jack, unable to find the words to express what I was feeling. "You've always had a way with words," I said finally, my voice breaking with emotion. "But this means more to me than you'll ever know." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and familiar. "You mean more to me than I'll ever be able to say," he replied softly. That night, as we sat together in the quiet of our home, I realized just how far we had come. The pain of the past would always be a part of our story, but it no longer defined us. What defined us now was the love we had rebuilt, the life we had created together, and the unwavering commitment to never stop growing, never stop trying, and never stop choosing each other. As the years continued to unfold, our family grew in unexpected ways. Evan graduated from college and found a career he was passionate about, while Lily pursued her dream of becoming a teacher. Watching them step into their own lives filled me with a sense of pride that was impossible to put into words. And when they eventually started their own families, Jack and I discovered the joy of grandparenthood. A love so pure and boundless it took my breath away. Through it all, Jack remained my anchor, my partner, my greatest source of strength. We weren't perfect, but we had learned how to navigate the imperfections together, leaning on each other when life felt overwhelming and celebrating each other's victories, no matter how small. Our love had evolved into something deeper and more enduring than I ever could have imagined. Something built not on the illusion of perfection, but on the reality of two flawed people who had chosen to stand by each other through it all. Looking back now, I can see that the journey we took, painful and difficult as it was, shaped us into the people we were always meant to be. It taught me the value of resilience, the power of forgiveness, and the beauty of a love that refuses to give up. And as I sit here reflecting on the life we built together, I feel nothing but gratitude for Jack, for our family, and for the chance to rewrite our story into something beautiful and true. The years continued to roll by, carrying with them moments both ordinary and extraordinary. Jack and I grew older, and with that aging came a quiet understanding of what it meant to truly share a life. Our days were no longer filled with the noise and chaos of raising children, but with a calm rhythm that came from decades of companionship. The love we shared was no longer fiery and urgent. Instead, it was steady, like a warm light that neither dimmed nor flickered, simply enduring through all the seasons of our lives. One summer evening, as we sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Jack reached for my hand. His grip was still strong, though his skin had grown rougher with time, and I marveled at how familiar and comforting that touch remained. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" he asked, his voice soft but tinged with the weight of memory. "All the time," I replied honestly, my gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was dipping low. "Sometimes I can't believe we made it through everything. And other times it feels like this was the only possible ending for us." Jack nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I think about the mistakes I made, the pain I caused, and I wonder how you ever found it in you to forgive me." "It wasn't easy," I admitted, squeezing his hand gently. "But I think I realized that holding on to anger wasn't going to make either of us whole again. Forgiveness wasn't just for you. It was for me too." He turned to look at me, his eyes soft with gratitude. "You saved us, Sarah. Even when I didn't deserve it, you saved us." I shook my head, laughing lightly. "We saved us, Jack. Took both of us. And a lot of work." That moment was one of many in those later years that reminded me how far we had come. Not just as a couple, but as individuals who had grown through the trials life had thrown at us. Our love had become something profound and unshakable, rooted not in the illusion of perfection, but in the reality of resilience, understanding, and choice. As our children grew older and built lives of their own, Jack and I found new ways to fill our time. We traveled more, exploring places we had always dreamed of visiting. In Italy, we wandered through vineyards and shared quiet meals under starlit skies. In Japan, we marveled at the beauty of cherry blossoms and found joy in the simple ritual of tea ceremonies. Each trip felt like a celebration, not just of the places we visited, but of the life we had rebuilt together. We also found joy in the everyday. Gardening became a shared passion. Jack would till the soil while I chose the flowers and vegetables we'd plant each season. On Sunday mornings, we'd linger over coffee and newspapers, relishing the unhurried pace of our lives. It wasn't glamorous or extraordinary, but it was ours, and it was enough. There were challenges too, of course. Health scares reminded us of our mortality, and the loss of close friends brought with it the sharp sting of grief. But through it all, we leaned on each other, just as we always had. Jack's presence was my constant, and mine was his, and together we faced whatever came our way. One of the greatest joys of our later years was watching our grandchildren grow. Lily and Evan both had families of their own, and their visits filled our house with the sound of laughter and tiny footsteps. The grandkids adored Jack, who had a knack for telling the kind of stories that left them wide-eyed with wonder. Watching him with them, I saw the same tenderness and devotion that had made me fall in love with him all those years ago. And when they'd climb into my lap, asking for one more story or snuggling close while I sang them lullabies, I felt a contentment that was hard to put into words. As time went on, the years seemed to blur together, each one marked by small milestones and quiet joys. Jack and I celebrated our 30th anniversary with a simple dinner at home, followed by dancing in the living room to the same song we danced to on our wedding night. By then, our movements were slower, but the love in our eyes was as vibrant as ever. "Still my favorite dance partner," Jack said, his voice warm with affection as he twirled me gently. "And mine," I replied, resting my head on his shoulder. Always. It wasn't until much later, as we approached our twilight years, that I truly understood the depth of what we had built together. Our marriage had been tested in ways I could never have imagined, yet it had endured. The cracks that had once threatened to tear us apart had been filled, not with the brittle glue of denial, but with the strength of truth, forgiveness, and commitment. Ours was a love forged in fire, and that fire had tempered us, made us stronger than we ever could have been on our own. In the quiet of our final years, as the world around us seemed to slow, I often found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. I thought about the pain and betrayal that had nearly broken us, about the long road to healing and the countless moments of joy and connection that had followed. And I realized that our story wasn't just about surviving the hard times. It was about thriving in spite of them. One evening, as the sun set over our garden, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack and I sat side by side on the porch swing, his arm wrapped around my shoulders. "You know," he said, his voice soft and thoughtful, "I think we've had a pretty good life." I leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my own. "I think so too," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. "Better than I ever could have imagined." And as the stars began to appear one by one in the vast expanse of the sky, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Jack, but for the journey we had shared, for the love that had carried us through, and for the life we had built together piece by piece, moment by moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that made it beautiful beyond measure. As the years rolled on, life became quieter, though no less meaningful. Jack and I settled into a routine that felt like slipping into a well-worn sweater, comfortable, familiar, and warm. The house, once bursting with the noise of children and their endless energy, now seemed vast and still. But rather than mourn what had passed, we found ways to savor the peace. Our mornings were slow and unhurried, marked by the smell of fresh coffee and the soft crackle of toast in the toaster. Jack would read the paper, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, while I lingered by the window watching the world wake up. In the afternoons, we would often take long walks through the neighborhood, our hands brushing together in a rhythm that spoke of decades spent side by side. It was a simple life, but it was full in a way that only comes from years of hard-earned contentment. Our children visited often, bringing their families to fill the house with life and laughter once more. Evan, now a father of 3, was patient and steady in a way that reminded me of Jack when we were younger. Watching him with his children filled me with a quiet pride, knowing that despite all the struggles, we had managed to give him a foundation of love and stability. Lily was as lively as ever, her quick wit and sharp mind making her a favorite among her nieces and nephews. She and her husband were a perfect match, their dynamic one of constant banter and mutual respect. The grandchildren brought a new kind of joy into our lives. Jack was their hero, always ready with a story, a game, or a piece of advice delivered with just the right mix of humor and wisdom. I found joy in teaching them to bake cookies or sew simple patterns, their little hands clumsy but eager as they worked alongside me. These moments, fleeting as they were, felt like treasures I tucked away in my heart, knowing they would sustain me in the quiet days ahead. One winter, as the snow blanketed the world outside, Jack and I sat by the fire, reminiscing about the past. "Do you remember that first Christmas after the annulment was finalized?" he asked, his voice low and reflective. I nodded, smiling faintly at the memory. "I remember you burned the turkey because you were trying to prove you could cook." Jack laughed, the sound rich and full. "Hey, I salvaged it." "Well, sort of. You did your best," I teased, leaning into his side. "That's what mattered." He grew quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around me. "You've always given me more grace than I deserved, Sarah. I don't think I ever thanked you properly for that." I looked up at him, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "You've shown your gratitude every day since then, Jack. That's more than enough." Time, as it does, continued its steady march forward. The grandchildren grew older, their visits becoming less frequent as they discovered their own lives and passions. Jack and I adjusted, finding joy in the smaller moments, the way the morning light filtered through the curtains, the quiet companionship of reading together in the evenings, the shared satisfaction of a garden well tended. But life is not without its trials, even in its later years. Jack's health began to waver as he entered his 80s, his strong and capable frame growing thinner, his steps slower. At first, He brushed off my concerns, insisting he was just tired or had overexerted himself. But as time went on, the truth became harder to ignore. Doctor's appointments confirmed what I had feared. His heart, though strong in spirit, was beginning to fail. We faced this new chapter together as we always had. Jack, ever pragmatic, accepted the news with a kind of grace that humbled me. "We've had a good run," he said one evening as we sat in the garden, the twilight casting a golden glow over his face. "I'm not afraid, Sarah. Not when I've had a life like this." I wasn't ready to lose him, but I knew better than to argue. Instead, I focused on making the most of the time we had left. We revisited old memories, looking through photo albums and telling stories that had become like well-loved songs, familiar yet endlessly comforting. Jack's laughter still filled the house, though it was softer now, tinged with the fragility of age. One night, as we lay in bed, his hand resting gently in mine, he turned to me with a look that was both tender and resolute. "When my time comes," he said, his voice steady, "I want you to promise me something." "Anything," I whispered, though the word felt heavy on my tongue. "Promise me you'll keep living. Don't let the grief swallow you. Keep finding the beauty in life, even without me." Tears welled in my eyes, but I nodded, knowing this was a promise I would honor, no matter how difficult it might be. Jack passed away on a quiet spring morning, the first blooms of the season swaying gently in the breeze outside our window.